just described, that we're going to be doing the three images seen on the screen: the little tortoise there, the squirrel, and the
tar plant.
tar plant. I guess we'll just intro again. We're doing the San Bernardino County at-risk species, specifically the desert regions, and I'm Josh.
I'm Grace.
I'm Alondra.
Alondra's joining us from elsewhere this evening, but she's going to be chiming in for various parts of the video. We've decided to do a series of art streams. I guess you'd call them bio art streams because we're talking about biological stuff as well as all other things related to these animals and plants as part of this region. But we're doing 3 streams, one for each main region within San Bernardino County. So we're starting out with the desert region, and then we're going to move to the valley and mountain regions. Not sure if that'll be the order, but we'll do those 3 regions from San Bernardino County. Within our county, we have a whole bunch of diversity of plant and animal species and other organisms, and many of these actually are endemic, which means that they are only found here in California or only found in this part of California, and so they are special for these ecosystems that they're a part of. Some of them are very important for the ecosystems. Some of them depend on the ecosystems for their survival, and our presence within these ecosystems has some effect on their existence, their survival, and so that's part of why we're talking about it. Some of these organisms we may never have heard of before, or you may be familiar with them. Regardless, we invite you to spend time with us learning about them and seeing them rendered artistically. So, San Bernardino County is the largest county within the contiguous United States, so that's the lower 48 states. If you think of the U.S., we've got our 48 states, and then you've got Alaska up in the northwest, you've got Hawaii out in the Pacific Ocean, and we've got the territories kind of scattered around. But within those lower 48 states in North America of the U.S., San Bernardino County is the largest. I believe the largest county overall would be in Alaska, since most of that is kind of county. I think it's one county or something like that. Yeah, so very large county, over 20,000 square miles within our county, which is larger than the states of Connecticut, New Jersey, and Delaware. If you think of the East Coast states, those are ones that could fit within just our county, let alone our state. There are, like I said, 3 main landscape regions within this county, and what takes up our desert region. Woo! Much of our desert region is taken up by the Mojave Desert, as well as part of the Sonoran Desert, which comes up from Mexico and into part of Arizona and California. It's also called the Colorado Desert, where it touches the eastern portion of our county. So you might hear me say Colorado, Sonoran Desert, similar area. You've also got the Mojave Desert, which is spelled both Mojave and Mohave, so some species, common names, or just labels for things will be written with both of those spellings. Our deserts in the state of California cover about 27% of our state and contain over 2,000 native plant species, let alone other species of organisms. That's about a quarter of these are endemic, which means they're only found here. And I've lost my spot in my notes.
That's alright.
And we're gone. No. And we're back. No. These are important ecosystems. If you think about a lot of issues when we talk about pollution, air pollution, climate change, things related to air quality, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and things of that nature. Deserts are very important ecosystems because they store over 10% of our state's carbon within the soil, within roots and shoots and parts of plants that are found here. So they're important in helping to clean the air and store or sequester some of that carbon in a place where it's not going to be just loose in the atmosphere, interfering with natural processes and things of that nature. Okay. About 70% of our county's landmass is desert. So like I said, largest portion is the deserts. A lot of times people, when they encounter the deserts here, it's on their way through to Las Vegas or Arizona, maybe up towards Central California, but many people probably don't realize what all's out there beyond the roads that they drive on. And most of that area is covered in a variety of desert landscape pieces. So you've got dunes, you've got shrublands, you've got cinder cones. These are kind of mounds, you could say, of cinder, which is a type of rock that comes from volcanic activity. So you've got former volcanoes that are now dormant there. You've got lava tubes in some places. You have the beginnings, the southern part of Death Valley. So you've got some of the aspects of Death Valley National Park there. You've got some of the northern portion of Joshua Tree National Park. So you've got Joshua trees, which are a special species of plant we've got here in California. Not named after this guy, but both named after Joshua in the Bible. There were many Mormon settlers that came through the deserts on their way to eventually settle in some of the valleys and other parts of the state. And on their way through, they saw those Joshua trees, and some of the stories go that they named them Joshua trees because they kind of reminded them of Joshua in the Bible and his leading the Israelites in their journeying from the desert into the Promised Land. Our desert region also includes the high desert. I mentioned that when I talked about the picture that's our background for this video. The high desert is called that because it's anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 feet above sea level. If you were to compare that to the lower desert, where like Palm Springs, Palm Desert, that area is, it's higher in elevation, hence the high desert nickname. And the high desert includes part of the western portion of the Mojave Desert. Alondra, feel free to jump in if anything catches your attention. Our desert region includes parts of Death Valley National Park, like I said, Havasu National Wildlife Refuge, which is near the border with Arizona. You've also got our Mojave National Preserve. There's our Sand to Snow National Monument, which actually includes part of the Morongo Basin area on your way out from San Bernardino, Yucaipa area toward closer toward Palm Springs. You're gonna go by the Morongo Basin or part of it. So that Sand to Snow National Monument starts in the desert, hence the sand, and ends up in the mountains, hence the snow in the term. And then we've got a lot of different wilderness areas found within this region. We've got towns and cities like Hesperia, Victorville, Apple Valley, Adelanto, Barstow, Needles, Zizix, which is fun, spelled Z-Z-Y-Z-X, 29 Palms, Joshua Tree, Morongo, and Wonder Valleys. Fort Irwin, Amboy, Goffs, Cadiz, Phelan, Baker, Oro Grande, Daggett, Yucca Valley, Earp, and several other ghost towns, former boom towns. Pioneer Town is a movie set that you may have seen in movies. places where Route 66 came through, and now it doesn't really get used as much, so those towns aren't as big. Former railroad stops, and even random post office boxes in the middle of the desert. So all this is enclosed within this desert region. Yeah, military bases, training facilities for various wars and things like that, filming locations. We've got abandoned mines, working mines, quarries, oases, natural springs, all different things. It's got it all. No, just kidding. It's got a lot of different variety of things within this region.
That's so interesting. It does have a lot of things.
Yep. As far as inhabitants, human inhabitants in this region go, some of the oldest traces of humans that have been found in the desert go back, they believe, up to 10,000 years ago. Don't know for sure, but long time ago. We've got some of the ancestors of the Serrano people, as well as the Yuma, and some of the other kind of desert dwelling groups around kind of came from some of those original groups in the thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. And many of them have spread out from that region since. So you have some of those Serranos that ended up some in the high desert, but also some ended up in the mountains and eventually down in San Bernardino Valley. That's where our San Manuel Band of Mission Indians comes from, is from the Serranos who were up in the mountains and came down seasonally, and then eventually when the reservations were set up, they kind of ended up being put there. We also have some Cahuilla people who were more so from the kind of Palm Springs area, but some of them ended up in the Morongo Valley as well. And some former Serrano and Cahuilla people were the ones that kind of founded the Morongo group that you've got the casino and reservation for out that direction. I think that's most of my pre-stuff. Any questions so far, Alondra or Josh? The tortoise is looking cute. He can now smell.
Well, in regards to we're gonna go in and talk about the tortoise, right?
Mm-hmm.
I did have some questions in regards to the tortoise. I wanted to ask you, what kind of food does this species like to eat?
Okay, good question. So our first organism is our desert tortoise. It is designated as a threatened species in the U.S., so by the U.S. federal government. But it has been it has been considered a threatened species. But actually, as of April 18th of this year, so merely a couple days ago, the California Fish and Game Commission actually voted to uplist the Mojave desert tortoise to endangered. So as of that, it's either already been changed to being endangered, or it's being considered to be considered endangered. It is technically our state reptile, so fun fact, if you ever have that on a trivia question, the California state reptile is the desert tortoise. They are going to be eating things like herbs, grasses, cacti or succulents, and wildflowers. And part of that depends on what's around them. They aren't usually going to travel super far if they don't have to. The desert is quite hot, and they tend to spend a lot of time underground in their burrows. But when they do come out, they're going to be eating things like herbs, grasses, cacti, other succulents, wildflowers. Um, and that's one of their big sources of water in some cases is going to be from those plants that store water within their structures. A lot of desert animals have adaptations that enable them to get their water that way through what they eat because they're in a desert that gets less than a foot of rain usually a year, um, unless you're last year and you get the 1,000-year rain or whatever they were calling it in 1,000-year flood in some parts of the desert. Usually you're not going to get a lot of rain, a lot of water readily available unless you're near an oasis or a spring or aquifer that's bubbling up, seeping up through the surface of the ground. So they need to be able to either get water through the things that they eat or have some way of trapping it near their home or have some way of storing it within their body themselves. So the desert tortoise is going to eat those plants that have water stored in them, but it also is going to store some of that extra water for later in its bladder. So fear not all of that will go to waste, but they do store it in their bladder, and that enables them to have a water store later on. They do go through dormant phases, so you could say kind of like a hibernation that they have in the wintertime, and then they have something similar in the summertime. They're most active in the spring and potentially some parts of the fall as well. But that dormancy, that kind of hibernation where they go to sleep, so to speak, is a way of conserving energy and water in the hottest and coldest parts of the year when they don't want to be losing a bunch of water and not surviving through to when there's more plants and things available for them to be eating and getting water from. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. My nephew actually has a tortoise, so I kind of know a little bit about him, but it's nice to like dive in and be like, oh, this is exactly like what they eat. I didn't know that they were endangered.
Yeah, so the desert tortoise is endangered. Not all tortoises necessarily are. But as far as like types or groups of animals go, turtles and tortoises are actually the second most imperiled group in the world, just down from non-human primates, they say. So as far as like vertebrates, animals with backbones and skeletons, they're one of the more imperiled, so more threatened or endangered groups of species, families you could say of species, are going to be those turtles and those tortoises. And some of that is because they're in ecosystems that are highly impacted by things like climate change or human activities or things like that, or they're dependent on resources that are maybe harder to get or things like that. They're a little more vulnerable as far as sudden changes in their ecosystem go. That's going to impact their numbers, their population, their survival a little more than maybe some organisms that can move around a little more or adapt a little better.
Okay. And I wanted to ask you, Grace, do these species like stay within like their family group, or do they kind of just go out? Yeah. Just go.
So as far as these tortoises go, they tend to kind of stay closer to their burrows. Like I said, they hibernate or are dormant at least 2 times of the year, and certain times of the day they also will stay in their burrow away from the hottest times when it's a lot drier and more severe on their bodies, the heat and such are. But there are times when they'll interact with other tortoises. So mating season is usually going to be whenever they're able to be out of their burrows, but more often it's going to be kind of springtime. And that's when you'll get a little more interaction between tortoises. Or if you've got maybe a tortoise looking for food or something, it might wander into another tortoise's area. Usually the females will mate, and then they'll have their eggs, and they'll put them in side of their burrow, um, or in a nest, I should say. And usually they're gonna lay about 14 eggs that are hard shelled. If you think of like a bird egg has a hard shell, tortoise egg, desert tortoise egg has a hard shell, and they're put in a nest. Usually this is happening May, June, July-ish time, so late spring, early summer. And then the nest is left as it is underground. Those eggs are going to incubate because of the warm soil around them. And then within about 70, 120 days, so a couple months, they're going to hatch. But usually at that point, they have been left alone. The moms lay the eggs, they put them in the nest, and then they leave. So if you think about those videos of like sea turtles laying their eggs and burying them and then going back out to sea, and then the little hatchlings have to scurry out when they hatch and go to the ocean, and then that's their like jump into the deep end, so to speak, beginning to being in the ocean. It's a little similar with these tortoises. The mom will set them up, the eggs up in a nice little nest, and then she leaves them be, and they hatch, and they're immediately on their own, so to speak, in the desert. So you get some interaction and moving around of these tortoises. Sorry, I confused myself. With these tortoises, but they're not like some animals that are gonna like migrate long distances or be like traveling very, very long distances around on the daily or monthly or weekly basis. They tend to kind of stay, I think, within the area that they're getting their food and water source from, within their kind of burrow area, and every once in a while they'll interact, or they'll have their young and then they'll leave. Sometimes males will even, if they come up against each other, they'll fight for dominance, to get another tortoise out of their territory if they end up in there. And usually that can last for, I think someone said, several hours. They're just like smacking each other,
Goodness.
trying to knock the other one over. And eventually one of them gives up or is too hurt or something and gives up. But yeah, that's probably the most violent that they'll get. It's just smacking each other around to fight for dominance within the territory.
And do they swim?
I didn't run into anything saying that they swim. There's not really usually enough water around for them to have to swim. Usually their burrows are underground, but they're not necessarily located by a consistent water source. They may be in areas that can get flooding, but I don't know that they necessarily usually have to swim around to get anywhere. If they're near an oasis that has a spring and water source mostly year-round available or part of the year available, they probably still aren't like right at the banks of the stream or the water source. They're a little ways away, where the soil is good for their burrow to be. I don't know if that answers the question. But yeah, their feet, as far as feet and things go, aren't necessarily built for swimming per se. They're more so built for digging, and that's why they live more so underground, where they can dig their burrow, dig a little catching basin for water that comes with the rain, but they're not necessarily going to be actively swimming unless they absolutely have to get away from water that suddenly come into their area, I think.
And then do they have a specific
Lifespan? So these tortoises have been known to live up to 70, 80, 100 years sometimes. So they can grow to be quite old, but not all of them will grow to be that old. There are a lot of things that stand in the way of them surviving that long in the wild, as far as Hatchlings, the young little babies or the juvenile tortoises go. Um, some say 1 in every 5 hatchlings. If you've got like a group of 100 in an area, one to five, sorry, is going to survive to adulthood. The other 99 to 95 probably aren't going to make it, and that's based on all different factors. Maybe they're eaten by coyotes or roadrunners or ravens or something else hungry in the area. Maybe there's a drought and they don't get enough water or enough food. All different things could be at play. Maybe their home gets crushed or things like that. That make it very hard for them to grow that old, but they can grow that old if given proper conditions to survive that long. Usually their shell doesn't get hard like you see in the picture, or you will see in the picture the next time Josh zooms out. Their shell doesn't usually get that hard until they're at least 5 years old or older than that. So they're soft. Their shells are soft for the first part of their life, which does make them more vulnerable to predators that are able to chew and digest them.
Now, the shell, does it help them in any way? I know you said when the shell is softer, it makes it easier for an animal to like eat them. But like, does their shell eventually like help them be protected?
Yeah, so it can help with some protection. Like I said, if a male ends up having to fight another male, that shell is important for protecting them. But it's also helpful because it does protect some of those soft, important organs and tissues. It enables them to have something to kind of close down and hide into if they need to hide from something once they are big enough that that shell is going to actually protect them a little better. Yeah. So yeah, the shell does protect them to some extent. Obviously, some predators may have figured out ways to get around the shell when trying to eat them, but they aren't a protective adaptation that these tortoises have.
Do you have 3 facts that you find fun or interesting about these tortoises?
Well, I have a bit of a random one. I don't know if you'd say it's gross or interesting, funny, but they say that the scat for the tortoises obviously scat as poop from animals is a good indication of what they're eating. But for desert tortoises specifically, they actually are gonna have a lot of large, not as chewed items in it because they don't really have like full on teeth and things to fully chew through stuff. There's a lot of things that come back out. So the scat's pretty large. They say that it's generally like in lines, like the food is kind of in lines in it, which is interesting. It reportedly smells like chewing tobacco. Couldn't tell you exactly why that is, but probably something to do with the fact they're chewing herbs and plants, and tobacco. But they say that for every 44 pieces of scat that's found, if researchers are like looking in an area for tortoises, every 44 pieces of scat they find, they'll usually find one living tortoise somewhere. But they have to find a lot of scat first before usually they'll find one.
Yeah.
So that's one fact.
Keep going.
Another fun fact: a lot of Native American or indigenous First Nations groups have stories. Part of their creation story involves the world being carried on the back of a turtle or tortoise. And so these animals as tortoises, as part of that turtle tortoise family, for some groups are kind of held in high esteem because they are. We've got a cameo going on. They are
Ah,
kind of
hello.
symbols of what the earth sits upon in those legends, those stories. Um,
Welcome to the.
do you have a tortoise that is smiling at the camera? Or on the camera?
Yeah.
Oh,
That's funny because I didn't know we were speaking about this, and my nephew was like, "My tortoise." I'm glad. So random, but
And then final fun fact. I think yeah. So I mentioned it already, but these tortoises, some of them will actually dig a little catch basin, so they'll dig a little impression in the ground. That's actually surrounded by soil, and it's gonna catch any rain that falls during the year, and then the tortoise knows exactly where it is, so it just comes back and goes, sips some of it, drinks some of it, and that's his little, that's their little water source spot if their storage bladder is out. Yeah, so fun fact there. Biggest thing with the tortoises, as far as like our seeing and dealing with them in the wild, it is as endangered species. It is unlawful to touch, harm, harass, or collect wild desert tortoises. So if you see wild ones in the wild, leave them wild. If something seems off or wrong about them, then it's good to tell proper authorities that can help them out. But as just the general public, it's good not to try to be messing much with them, just because they are wild animals. They are threatened and endangered species. They are dealing with a habitat that's already got issues that make it hard for them to survive, and it can be harder if people are messing with them as well. So if you see one, keep your distance. If it seems injured or something else is wrong with it, it's good to let people know. Usually that would probably be like wildlife service or something like that. Um, some of these species are impacted by the illegal pet trade. So if you see desert tortoises being sold, maybe look further into how they were acquired and things like that before you start trying to get one as a pet. Their habitats, their homes are also destroyed by or degraded by urban development, so like towns and suburbs expanding. You also get industry related things, you get mines and things like that that are looking at places that are potentially habitat for these tortoises. There are also parts of the high desert that are, or the deserts in our region that are highly impacted by off-roading vehicles. So like people like to ride in the dunes or ride in the sand, but some of those places they ride aren't designated to be ridden on with off-roading vehicles, and part of that reason is they could very likely be habitat for some of these species that don't have a lot of places for habitat, and so that can destroy some of the burrows and places that these animals live, as well as just increased predation or being eaten by things like ravens, that usually aren't in big numbers, but their numbers, their populations have grown a lot with the addition of a lot more people in the desert regions. More people usually is going to produce a lot more trash, and those ravens are thriving on some of that trash, as well as some of the baby tortoises that still have those soft shells. And then things like climate change, so like increasing temperatures, hotter summers over time, sudden wet seasons where you got a lot more flash flooding or wildfires, things that are going to burn or drought, things that are going to burn or kill away some of the vegetation that they depend on, things like that are all going to affect these tortoises.
Got it. Well, some interesting facts apart from knowing about them. It definitely changes my perspective and point of view. When you said, "Oh, it's untouched," them, I was like, "Oh wait, there's a difference between pet ones and desert ones."
Yeah, if it's at like a museum or somewhere that seems credible, and they've got one as maybe an ambassador type species that's kind of a representative of its species and is helping to educate the public, and they offer it like a chance to touch it, then that might be more kosher. But if it's just in the wild, don't be going in, oh, and then like touching things, because you don't know what bacteria and other stuff is on them or what they've been in. But also you don't want to harm them by thinking you're doing something, just touching them and then causing harm or scaring them or things like that. I mentioned that they store some of that extra water in their bladder, but if they feel frightened, they will, like humans, release that liquid from their bladder. But then for them, that's probably worse than a human, because there goes their water storage. Usually for us, that's waste material. For them, that's hydrating material. And so if they've been frightened and they've lost that, then they've just lost some of the water that might have held them over longer in the dry part. So just being aware of our surroundings, aware of what we're doing, interacting with them, and that will definitely help, as well as some other stuff that was mentioned already.
You definitely expanded my knowledge on tortoises.
Okay, shall we move on to our
Yes, we can.
tar plant? Okay, so that is a picture of a tar plant. That one, ooh, there it is. Is considered a rare plant, so you may never have seen that plant in your life. Not to say that there aren't a bunch of other plants you probably have not seen, because there are a lot in this world. But this is a rare plant in this county. It is considered endangered for the state of California. I don't think it has a designation as of now for the country, but that's likely mainly because it's mostly found here in the California area. So endangered. It is. It is. It has a scientific name. I apologize if I say this wrong. Deanandra mohavensis. So it actually has Mojave in part of its scientific name, and that's cool. A number of these desert-dwelling animals actually have part of the place they're found in the name. For the tortoise, it was Zerabates agassiz, or Gophurus agassiz. I thought Gophurus is cool because that's the genus name for some of the tortoises, and they dig burrows like gophers, or not necessarily like gophers, but they live underground like gophers, and Gophurus is in their name. Fun. But yeah, so that's the Mojave tar plant, Deanandra mohavensis. It is an annual herb, so it's gonna grow for a year, and then it's going to produce seeds. Those seeds will grow into a new plant if they have the right conditions eventually. Usually the bloom period for these plants is going to be between June and October. There may be a little bit of leeway on either end, but it all depends on when water is available. As far as wildflowers, some of these are called forbs. As far as the forbs, the wildflowers, some of those plants go, a lot of them are very dependent on water. So if there's a lot of water available, they're going to spring up a lot quicker. If there's not a lot of water available, they're not going to be as likely to uh, start to grow above the surface of the ground and produce flowers or even just grow. Uh, from the seed form, they may stay dormant for a long time waiting for the right conditions. And that's why some parts of the desert, some parts of the chaparral valleys, and parts of Southern California, you suddenly get big blooms, super blooms of wildflowers of various types, is because there's suddenly enough water and other material available within the soil that all the little seeds that have been dormant and waiting suddenly just go wee, and they all burst forth from the ground and produce very pretty and colorful and interesting flowers. So these are flowering plants. As you can see, we've got a picture here that has the flowers, which is nice. They are usually going to grow in areas that get about 15 to 25 inches of rain a year. So maybe in parts of the desert that have a little more water available potentially than maybe some of those desert tortoises, but they are in a desert, so there isn't still going to be that much water overall. They grow in elevations of anywhere from 2,460 to over 8,000 feet above sea level, so they can be found within this desert region. They may also kind of creep up the sides of some of the mountains as well. They are able to grow in shaded spots, so they'll grow underneath other plants or shrubs or trees that are taller. And they can also withstand low water conditions, but they do need water to survive, so there needs to be some form of water. Usually wet seasons in these areas are only about 3 to 7 months, depending again on how much water is available, and that enables them to grow when there is water available, usually anywhere from 2 to 6 months out of the year. They usually can do okay with soil that's a little less than neutral, so if you think of water, pH is 7. If you think of like acidic things like lemon juice, that's going to be more acidic, so its pH is going to be lower than 7. If you think of basic things like a lot of cleaners, ammonia, things like that, they're going to have a pH that's higher than 7. Usually the soil needs to be slightly acidic or near neutral, near 7, and these plants will grow in that. Okay. They will grow in sandy soils, so they don't need to have something smooth. They can grow in something that's a little more sandy, grainy, closer to some dunes and things like that, and they are able to grow in that type of habitat. They have leaves that can be serrated, so if you think of like the edge of a knife has those bumps on it that make it kind of sharp or bumpy at least, or if you think of a holly leaf at Christmas time has those like serrations in it. Their leaves can also be serrated and kind of bumpy on the edges. Sometimes they might be smooth on the edges as well. They're going to be kind of hairy, so they're going to be fuzzy. They'll have little hairs on them. And they can have little glands on their stalks as well. They produce inflorescences, so if you think of a flower, some plants only have one flower that they produce when they're blooming, or like maybe one flower here, one flower there. They produce inflorescences, which means it's a number of flowers on the same stalk that are being produced. So on the picture you can see there's like one main stem, and then you've got a lot of little flowers coming off of them. Sunflowers are an example of a type of flower that's actually an inflorescence. It's got a bunch of little flowers all making it up. And that means that there are going to be a lot more seeds produced if it's pollinated than just a single flower that usually maybe produces 1 to a couple of seeds. Inflorescences will have a little more seeds usually produced. So that enables them to be more likely to reproduce if they make more seeds that go out in it. Flowers can be easier. Some of them may be a little more brown in color. Some of them may be shaped kind of like discs, and some of them will be more like rays, kind of like of the sun, coming out from a middle part of it, like you see on the flower that Josh has created there. And these will grow in places like chaparral areas of the desert. So if you think of, if you've ever been around parts of the Inland Empire, you might see some of the hillsides have those like short shrubs and yuccas and things like that that make up what we call the chaparral habitat. There is a little bit of that that goes into some of our deserts, and these flowering plants can survive in some of that chaparral area where there's shrubs. They can also live in woodlands, so places where you've got maybe some oaks and things like that growing, potentially maybe on the edges of mountains, still in the desert, and then they can also grow in desert scrub habitats, which are also a little similar to chaparral. You've got like those shorter, lower to the ground types of plants that kind of cluster together, and then you've got like places on the ground that are more spread out and bare.
Nice. I do have one question because you pretty much answered like the questions that I had on this specific plant. But does any specific type of animal like eat this plant or?
They are going to be eaten by things that are eating seeds. If you think of tortoises, I didn't see this listed, but they do eat wildflowers. So if this was an available thing around, they might try to eat it. But you might get some other reptiles or rodents that utilize portions of the plant's stems or flowers, leaves. You might get some insects that will utilize parts of the flowers and the plants for food sources. If you're talking things like bees or other pollinators, a lot of those are going to be collecting pollen or nectar as something to eat or utilize for their young. So they might be used in that sense for those sorts of things. Usually when you've got a lot of flowers blooming and they're native plants or plants that the native and local pollinating species, insects, are able to use, then you'll get a lot of like insects around those plants. So you might get things like bees, I don't know about wasps, but bees, beetles, butterflies potentially, or moths coming toward them. Part of it depends on what else is available in that specific habitat in that desert region that they found. Yeah, but you might get rodents like ground squirrels, mice, rats, things like that, using some of their pieces as food sources.
Hit the wrong rotation.
It said, and I'm holding on by the flower.
Yeah, well, you pretty much hit all the questions that I had down in regards to this plant. But yeah, I was gonna ask you about the color, but you went over the color.
Yep, so they got a brownish stem. They've got leaves that are more green, and then petals on the flowers that can be yellow to kind of brownish yellow, bright yellow to brownish yellow.
I love yellow, so that would be what.
These are a species of wildflower, there are some conservation groups that are actively collecting seeds from desert plants and desert plants in general to they're accumulating what's called a seed bank, which is a place where they're storing a bunch of collected seeds. Some of them maybe for research purposes, but a good portion of them are also just in case the species becomes more imperiled, something happens, and they need to try to grow new plants or reintroduce them to an area. They've got those seeds for the future to kind of have some plan for the future in case something happens to these plants, some of which are historically, culturally significant to different people groups. Some of them are important ecologically for ecosystems. Some of them important food sources for the other organisms in the ecosystems. And so this is one of those plants that some groups are actively collecting some of the seeds from to store for future use in case they are needed. These plants are highly affected by drought. Obviously, they do best when there's water available, and if there are severe enough droughts where there's not much water available, they will die and or just not grow from their seeds. Their seeds will remain dormant. And that if the seed's dormant, it's not going to be actually producing the plant that will produce more seeds, so you're basically just left with the seeds that are in the soil already. They are also affected by wildfires, by soil compaction. So when you've got a lot of foot or vehicle traffic going through an area where there's soil, over time the weight and force of those things going over will compact or push the soil together so that it gets really hard and hard to move around, hard for roots to move through, for some animals to dig down into, for water to soak down into, and that can cause problems for these plants as well as other organisms living within those areas where soil's been compacted. They're also probably going to be susceptible to, or have issues, I should say, in areas that get a lot of erosion. So if you've got a lot of soil that is being moved around, when we talk about erosion and weathering, weathering is a process that breaks down rocks into smaller pieces, either chemically or just physically breaking off pieces. And erosion is going to be the process that actually moves those rocks, those pieces, and some of those original bigger rocks to new locations. And that can be just a few inches or feet away. But often if you're talking about things like flash floods or times when there's a drought and high winds, that's going to be moving various sizes of particles of rock and dirt and dust good distances, and that can quickly change the layout of a landscape. If you think of a stream bed or even a trail or something like that, if you've ever been on one that suddenly has like a weird gash in the ground where like water came through and just cut a portion out, that can dramatically change a landscape, and that can cause problems for plants that have roots that were trying to establish themselves. Suddenly the ground is gone, or they get ripped up with the ground that gets moved, and that can also affect the plants. Yeah, all things like that. And then obviously, if there are invasive plant species, things like non-native grasses that spring up within their habitat, those might take up some of the space that the tar plants need. They may also take some of the nutrients and the water from the soil that the tar plants need to survive. They may also attract non-native species of animals that may not be beneficial for the plants, so they might eat those plants as well or damage them in some way. or fail to help them pollinate, like some of the native species of pollinators might, and that can also affect their ability to reproduce and continue to further generations as well. There are also, I just peeked at notes and was reminded, a lot of these organisms are affected by habitat. I said degradation, where it's being kind of destroyed or worn away, things are being messed up within the habitat, but they also are affected by habitat fragmentation, which means you're taking a habitat and breaking it up into pieces. And that doesn't necessarily mean someone's coming and like ripping it apart, because that's hard to do. But maybe there are developments, human developments, or other things kind of cutting the habitat up into smaller pieces, and that can make it hard for migrating animals. It can make it hard for animals that maybe lived in the area that just got developed into a parking lot or something else, or a road. But it can also be hard for the plants that require wind to pollinate them, so to take the pollen to nearby plants. But if the nearby plants aren't there anymore, that makes it hard for them to pollinate by the wind. And it can make it hard for plants that require animal pollinators, because some of those animal pollinators can't travel very far. So if they live on this side, sorry, I used my hand. If they live on this side of the habitat and the plants are here and they're close, then that's good. But if something has separated them, then it makes it a little harder for them to get to them. And sometimes water, in the course of maybe humans reshaping some of the landscape, a lot of times will divert water to help us to survive, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. It's good to be able to get water, but it can be bad for some of the species of animals and plants that also require that water, and have naturally been used to the water being in that spot. So if water's been directed in a different direction away from where the plants are growing and usually getting moist soil, and then they no longer have that moisture in the soil, then that can also cause them to die out.
Well, it's definitely a lot more than you would just think of, like when you think of a plant. There's a lot more to each plant, and yeah, especially how you described it and everything. But that's really cool. Yeah, I've never even heard of the plant before.
The Mojave tar plant, or tarweed, sometimes it's called as well.
Tarweed. Nice. I'll have to look up more pictures.
Yeah, there are some other pictures they have. Some of these things, like this plant, in some areas they thought was gone, like completely, and then it suddenly, like several years later, they found it again within its historical range, and they're like, wait, it's still here, it's here. And some of that's because they come from seeds that can lay dormant for a long time, and so you may have seeds that lay dormant for several decades, and then suddenly they get the right conditions and pop up where people weren't, like, start growing where people weren't expecting them, or where they were expecting them but they thought they were gone for good. So their range kind of changes to some degree. Current range changes to some degree based on where we actually can visibly see they're growing, because some of those seeds may still be where they used to grow, but they're not experiencing conditions that are good enough for them to be fully growing roots and shoots and leaves and flowers and things like that.
To be fully operational?
Yes, they're not ready to be fully operational yet. They're in their dormant phase under the ground. Sleeping. They're sleeping. Okay. Any final questions about the tar plant, or things you want to add, Josh?
Pretty.
Yes.
Like the yellow.
Bright color. Yeah, you get a lot of browns and grays, some maybe reds, or maybe blacks, maybe gray greens. Within the desert, when you're not thinking of the plants, and then when you've got the plants, you've got maybe some gray greens, some greens, some browns. But then you get some of those flowering plants that have those bright colors, and you're like, ooh, color! And those aren't visible all the time. They require those sudden rainstorms or that wet season or other ripe conditions to help them flourish and bloom. And usually they don't bloom super long. They're kind of there. They utilize the pollinators that are available. They produce their seeds, or maybe if they're able to self-pollinate, they might do that. They'll produce their seeds, and then those flowers will die away, and the seeds will go on to hopefully grow new plants sometime in the future. They're very dramatic when they all start blooming at once. Those desert wildflowers.
I looked up before doing this call, and a lot of they're all so pretty. But I do have to go.
Okay.
You guys are gonna go and dive into the next animal. But I hope you guys have a wonderful time, and thank you guys so much for just allowing me to be a part of your guys' call. It's such a pleasure, and I feel like I've learned so much. So I am so excited to keep learning, and I hope all of you guys had a great time. I know these two are gonna keep on talking, but you guys have a wonderful day and a wonderful night. You guys take care.
Thanks for
Bye,
joining us,
Bebe.
Alondra.
Bye, Alondra.
See you later. Talk with you later. Have a good night.
You guys as well.
I was just trying to rhyme. We can do that if we do a kangaroo rat later. We could do that. You were on there twice.
Nope, I was on there twice.
Okay. Well, we will move on to our ground squirrel. I'll let you get that adjusted.
We have returned in a greater size. But
we're disappearing. That's
there we
what's
go.
happening. On the move again. No, just kidding. Ooh, zooming in.
So this is what we got so far.
We've got our desert tortoise.
Let me zoom.
Okay. And our Mojave tar weed or tar plant. And finally, the Mojave ground squirrel. Dun dun! The Mojave ground squirrel is endemic to the Mojave Desert area, specifically the western portion. So if you think of more toward, if you think of where the Cajon passes between the San Gabriel and San Bernardino mountains, up into the Hesperia, Adelanto, Victorville, Apple Valley area, and you continue on north and northwest from there. Kind of those towns mark the southern portion of its range, and then you continue on a little to the north. It also goes a little bit into Los Angeles County, as well as parts of other counties a little further north. But these squirrels their main ranges kind of in the western portion of the Mojave Desert, high desert area in our county. They are considered threatened in the state of California They do not currently have a federal designation that I could see previously. They tend to, similar to the desert tortoise, have burrows, homes underground, hence the ground squirrel term in their common name. Their scientific name is Xerospermophilus mojavensis. So we've got another mojavensis, another Mojave name within the name. They are diurnal, so we've talked about nocturnal before in the previous art stream. Nocturnal animals are animals that are most active at night in the nighttime hours, though they could be active or move around other times of day. It just partly depends on what they're feeding on, things like that. As far as diurnal animals go, these are animals that are most active in the daytime. So they're going to be most active looking for food and things like that when it's light outside. You might hear our mom in the background. She's just reacting to something someone else said in the other room. These are small rodents. And so they're not going to be super gigantic if you see one. Small squirrel sized. I guess medium sized for a ground squirrel. They can be about 9 inches long. Their tail can be about 2 to 2.5 inches long. So not super long if you think of if you've been in our mountains and you've seen those gray squirrels with the big fluffy tails, or you've seen those fox squirrels that are brown with kind of the fluffy tails. Ground squirrels tend to have smaller tails, not as big, poofy, fluffy, because they live underground. When you've got a smaller tail that's not as large and such, it makes it a little easier to squeeze into and move around underground in tunnels, and so they've got those shorter kind of 2 to 2.5 inch tails. As you can see, they're kind of tannish brown in color. They have some white on the underside of their tail, as well as some striping on their backs sometimes. You may also have some lighter patches toward the underside or feet areas. They can be grayish brown as well. You might even get what some consider a pinkish cinnamon. It's kind of a pinkish brown color. And this likely is going to enable them to camouflage. A lot of desert animals that can be prey for other animals are going to be have colorations that are similar to the habitat around them, so they're not as likely to be spotted by things like golden eagles or red-tailed hawks, or ravens, coyotes, things like that. Makes it a little easier to hide when you've got a place that may not always have coverage, plants and things that they can hide under. It helps to kind of blend in a little better with the ground and the hole that you might be peeking out of but don't want to fully be seen peeking out of. Juveniles can be a little more of that kind of cinnamon brown color, so young ground squirrels that aren't quite mature yet will be a bit different colored, and then they molt, so they lose some of that fur and will develop more of that kind of grayish brown color that they get when they're more mature. Their skin itself is actually quite dark, darkly pigmented, so it's dark in color. If you think of like a polar bear, it's got actually really dark skin underneath its light fur. These guys have darker skin under their fur, and sometimes you might actually be able to see that if it's a day where the ground squirrel is trying to cool itself off, it might actually kind of have all much of its fur kind of bristle around it to provide airflow, and that can actually reveal some of that darker skin underneath. And they will be dormant in the majority of the year. Similar to the tortoise, they kind of are dormant in the hottest and coldest parts of the year. So the summer, the winter time, they're more likely to be hibernating or experiencing something called aestivation, Aestivation, which is kind of similar to hibernation. This is something that they do where they're dormant during the summertime when it's the hottest. They're gonna be kind of sleeping, their metabolism slows way down, and their body kind of goes into like a sleep or hibernation stage where they're just kind of there in their hole, conserving energy, conserving water and other resources, so they don't have to be out foraging for food when the ground is super hot and dry, and there's not much water available to them. Oops,
Good.
They will mate in the springtime if there's enough water available. So there have been cases where ground squirrels were observed maybe in a very dry year in the spring, and they didn't mate at all. They just kind of came out and foraged and ate and survived through the spring, and then they were dormant for a good portion of the summer, maybe came back out a little bit in the fall, were dormant again in the winter, and then if there's more water available, then they're more likely to mate and have their young. And that's likely partly because more water usually means more plant food supply will be available for them and their young, and they're more likely to survive, as well as their young are a little more likely to survive if there's water and food available. So that's an interesting behavior adaptation that these organisms have, these animals have, that enables them to survive a little better in a region that can be very dry and hot, but can also experience sudden amounts of water coming down and providing water for the area that they live in. Major threats to their habitat include drought, a lot of the same things we've seen with the other two species we talked about: drought, loss of habitat, fragmentation or breaking up of their habitat, degradation or destruction of their habitat, often based on human activity or development of towns, businesses, facilities for maybe even getting renewable energy sources. There have been some large-scale renewable energy facility projects that have been started, and then they realized that they actually posed a big threat to the habitat of some of these ground squirrels, and that has caused some delays for that, but it also is something to consider when making decisions to be more renewable and helpful for the planet, making sure that you're not forgetting to be considerate of where you're putting that stuff and causing trouble for some other part of the planet in trying to help the planet. You can see that in a lot of environmental conservation and preservation efforts, just making sure that the approach is well-rounded. You're thinking about all the different factors involved, and you're not just jumping into, we need renewable energy, and then forgetting about where you're setting that up or where you're getting materials and things from. Mining operations can also, and quarry operations can cause some issues for some of these habitats, both for the ground squirrels and some of these other organisms. If you've got chemicals seeping into the soil or the water that they are utilizing, that can cause problems for them as well as other organisms that depend on them or that they depend on. So that's an issue. It can also cause issues for humans too if you've suddenly got cyanide seeping from mines that ends up in your drinking source or in your soil that ends up in your plants. That's also not good for you. They're also going to be impacted by some of those same things, off-roading vehicles, driving where they're not designated to do so, and crushing some of the soil, compacting it, but also destroying some of their burrows and their homes. They can also be affected by damage to the surface of the soil that is the entrance to their homes, or providing space for some of those plants and things that they depend on. You also get things like ravens, other predatory animals, coyotes, foxes, things like that are going to be eating them. If you get too many of those predators in an area, that's problematic for your smaller prey animal populations, because then they eat them up and then they're not there anymore. Things like viruses and diseases that are introduced accidentally, maybe by other animals that are non-native species, exotic species from other places, that might introduce things, pathogens, diseases, viruses that are going to cause problems for the survival of these species. You can also get human-wildlife conflict. So something we didn't mention with the desert tortoises, but is an issue. There are roads that go through the desert, and it's not like some regions in our county where you've got a bunch of like intersecting roads all over, it seems like, but there are enough roads that you do get strikes from vehicles from time to time when you've got tortoises or ground squirrels or other animals trying to cross over the road to get to the part of the habitat that used to be connected or that has better food or whatever for them. You might get populations decreasing due to some of those strikes. Now that may not be as likely to cause the whole population to decrease as some other things, but it is also an issue. Just making sure if you're driving on the roads to be careful and watch what's on the road, make sure you're not just running over or running into things that we're trying to cross. And some ecosystems have special things that people have set up to help some of those animals to be able to cross under roads to enable them to make their migrations or journeys to get food and water and things like that. So there are things like that that can also help reduce some of the amount of vehicular strikes and other wildlife interactions, conflicts with humans that can be avoided a little easier than some others. They're affected by wildfire, types of pollution, both in the water and in the soil, things like that. They're going to be affected by agriculture that's happening in the desert in some places, that may be taking up habitat space, but may also be introducing pesticides, insecticides, things like that are either going to kill their food source or could accumulate in what they're eating and then transfer into them and make them sick, kill them, or cause other trouble for future generations down the line. Yeah, these are all things that can highly impact them. Yeah. Any questions you have so far on the ground squirrels, Josh?
Nope. They're pretty cute though. I'll give them that.
Yeah, there's.
Did you mention their diet?
I did not specifically yet. I'm trying to remember where I put that on this thing. Oh, here it is. They eat various foods. That's very specific. They've been known to have material within their scat that includes types of fungus, types of animal bones, arthropod fragments, so like the exoskeletons of insects and things like that, as well as plant material. So large portion of what they eat is plants. Some of that is going to include like flowering plants, so pieces of flowers, pollen, seeds, but you can also get things that maybe aren't plants or aren't flowering plant material as well that they will eat. Part of that is likely going to be based on what's available around them at the time of year that they're looking for food. So things like forbs, wildflowers, they're also called, may not be available when they're getting toward the beginning of the fall, but you may get some of them available at that time. But you may get more of those in the spring, so they'll eat maybe more of those when those are available. But they will eat things like leaves and stems from shrubs. They'll also eat, like I said, pieces of flowers. They'll eat things that maybe are smaller little animals, things like that, that they will include in their diet. But again, that's mainly based on the season of the year, how much rain has fallen, and how much water is available for the plants they're eating, the animals they're eating, and themselves. And that's part of how they are affected by things like herbicides or pesticides. If you've got maybe an agricultural area nearby that uses those, often those don't stay just in the agricultural area on the crops. When rain or irrigation waters those, that water runs off somewhere else, or seeps down into the ground, which seeps down into underground water stored aquifer areas, where water is sitting or flowing underground, and that can eventually carry some of those toxins over into areas adjacent, so next to those or further down away from there, where it affects the plants and the animals and the things within the soil, as well as those that depend on the plants and things that are coming up out of the soil. And that can accumulate or add up within an animal as it eats more of those, and that can also continue up the food chain to higher animals in the food chain, like the big predators and things like that. And that can cause sickness, that can cause death, that can cause them to not be able to have young, but it can also cause young to not be able to survive or live or have young of their own, things like that, which affects their ability to reproduce and have further generations after them. I've gone too far. I was like, I've gone to something that's talking about amphibians. Sneak peek for next time.
Ooh.
We may talk about an amphibian in one of the next videos. Any other questions that you have? They are eaten by snakes, potentially, as well as some of those birds I mentioned. Bobcats, feral cats, dogs,
Oh.
coyotes, ravens. Anything big enough to eat them might eat them, if it were desperate enough. Foxes.
What family does this squirrel come from? What family do squirrels come from in general?
Good question. So they're part of the rodent family. And let me just bring this up for myself so I'm not missaying this. I don't know why I'm just looking at this. They are from the. Just turn to this. This is more handy. Apologies. Many pages must be turned to find the rodents in this thing. So they're from the rodent family. That's going to include things like mice, rats, gophers, voles, moles, those smaller ground-dwelling animals. Just kidding. Squirrels, chipmunks, things like that also fall in the category. Obviously, this is squirrel within that category. Capybaras fall in this category. Guinea pigs, hamsters, porcupines even fall in this. Chinchillas, all things like this are gonna kind of fall under the category of rodent, and that's a larger family. When you get into things like squirrels, this type of squirrel, you're gonna get more into specific genuses or genera, and then from there you get into your species and subspecies, and that's where you get your scientific names from. So, fun fact, if you ever see a scientific name, usually the genus is what is the first word that's capitalized. The second word that's not capitalized is usually the species name, and then sometimes there's another name after that that's like a subspecies name that's like very specific for that exact species of animal that you're looking at. That is called their binomial nomenclature. Binomial just means two names. Nomenclature has to do with the naming or titling of something, the wording of how you say something. So the binomial nomenclature is just the scientific name for an organism, and it is made up of that genus, that larger category that falls underneath a family of animals. So you've got your family, you've got your genus, which is a little more specific, and then you've got your species, which is even more specific. So that scientific name is a genus, and species names pushed together, and that can kind of help you if someone were to, for whatever reason, ask you, what genus did these come from? You've got it usually right there within the scientific name. And that's just something that scientists and other people use to help kind of classify the different animals and other living things you find on the earth. Because there are so many, it's just a way to help us keep track of all of them and what ones seem to be more related to each other than others. Yeah. Some of these names are named after things, so like the ground squirrel that has mohavensis in the species name, and the tar plant that also had mohavensis in the species name. Those are obviously both named to some degree after the region that the desert area that they are found in, the Mojave Desert area. Some animals may have part of a person's name in their scientific name, and that's maybe to pay homage or honor the person that discovered them, or maybe somehow is related to their discovery, or something about them, something about that area that they're found in. And then sometimes there are other things. I just peeked at something that's talking about a Las Vegas bear poppy, which is a type of flower, a poppy flower, that lives closer to Las Vegas. And the scientific name has Californica in it because California is one of the regions where you find it. And you'll see that in a number of different species. May have part of the name of the state or a place that they're kind of found in, which is interesting. Any other questions, sir?
I have no more.
Okay. Then I guess we'll finish out with just a recap of what we talked about. We talked about our desert tortoise, our Xerobaites or Gophurus agassiz, a threatened and endangered species that lives within the desert region of our county. We have our Mojave tar plant, as you can see in the middle image. Can you see it? So, that you
down just so you
could
can
have
see
seen.
it.
Okay, yes. So we've got our desert tortoise on your left. We've got the Mojave tar plant in the middle. That is our Hemizonia mojavensis, state endangered species plant. And then we have on the right, we have our Mojave ground squirrel, Spermophilus mojavensis, which is a threatened state species. For each of these and many other plants and animals and things of that, within this desert region, a lot of them are impacted or have been impacted by ecosystem or habitat degradation, fragmentation, the loss of some of their habitat or most of their habitat. They've been impacted by agricultural practices, the use of pesticides and herbicides, both for agriculture and for residential areas. They've been impacted by the growth of urban or suburban town, city spaces, the expansion of human development, of buildings and roads and infrastructure and things like that require space that usually is where some sort of habitat is or has been, as well as the illegal or undesignated activities of off-road vehicles, off-highway vehicles, sometimes they're called OHVs, like off-roading in the sand dunes or parts of the desert that just haven't been designated for that because they are habitats for threatened, endangered, or just special species only found in this area of the world. And so those can definitely be damaging or harming to the individual animals and plants, as well as to the places that they need to grow. Things like soil compaction we talked about, where the soil is being beaten down by use of vehicles or foot traffic or other things pushing down on them. That can be hard for water to seep through that's needed by some of these animals. It can also be harder for them to dig in or roots to go down in. It can cause damage to the surface of the soil. It can cause increased erosion because now you've got a bunch of dirt that's been moved around and it's more likely to move around because water and wind come through. You've got the disruption of habitats because of non-native species of plants and animals that come in and may bring diseases or outcompete the native species for resources, nutrients, water, things like that. Food sources. You've got increased predator activity because you've got more ravens or more of certain predators that maybe didn't have larger numbers at one point. Increased diseases, like I said, loss of species, illegal pet trade, human-wildlife conflict, drought, wildfires, climate change-related things, so hotter, drier summers, sudden more extreme natural storms and things like that, or maybe sudden super cold, wet wet seasons, activities with mining and other extraction of ores, use of toxic chemicals in those processes, pollution coming over from larger cities, or vehicles and things coming through, and then changes to the hydrology or the water sources within the ecosystem. So redirecting water for agricultural or urban purposes, controlling floods. Some areas require flood or fire to be able to reproduce and survive properly, and if we alter some of that stuff too much, control all the floods, control all the fires, it makes it hard for some of these plants and animals to live how they naturally would in their ecosystem. So these are all things to consider when we're thinking about human and just impact of things on these ecosystems and the animals and plants and other things that call them home. But there is hope. There are things that we as humans can do, and as residents of this county can do. Things like picking up trash, removing graffiti, or just not putting them there to begin with. Removing invasive species, maybe thinking before you let out your whatever animal into the wilderness, thinking before you go off-roading in an area that maybe isn't designated as fun and adventure-filled as it might be, being more considerate of the actions that we are making, the decisions and things we're making and doing within the desert area when we're there, things like that, or even participating in some of the conservation efforts that are being made within these regions can be helpful. So there are scientists and others that are doing things like vertical mulching, which is where they're going to put material on the ground that enables moisture to be held by the soil. It enables shade to actually cover an area that maybe doesn't have shrubs at the time, and it enables seeds and things to be able to grow a little better, and can actually restore that part of the habitat. So helping with some of that sort of thing. There are people that are gathering seed samples and seeds, like I said, for research purposes and for storage for the future. Being able to maybe restore areas with things like plants that animals need to survive. Being able to restore water to areas that had water at one point, but some of that water has been diverted. Maybe finding ways to bring some of that back, or help to protect that. Finding ways to connect fragmented, separated parts of habitats that have animals that need to get between, having those corridors or linking points between them. Doing what we're doing now, helping share more about these unique habitats and the animals and plants and fungi and all that stuff that call them home, some of the cultural importance of these areas. Like I said, there have been people living within these deserts for thousands and thousands of years, and there are artifacts and things within sacred places in them, cultural significant areas, geologically significant areas. Like I mentioned, we got former volcanoes and dormant volcanoes and super cool rocks and things within this area. So finding ways to share with the general public, with others, to advocate for conservation and preservation, for better stewardship or responsible use of our resources and care of the things around us. And then maybe even participating in citizen science projects, helping scientists by taking pictures of the things that you see. Sometimes maybe you actually see a tar plant and you didn't even realize it, but you take a picture of it and you put it on something like iNaturalist, which is a site online where people put their observations, and scientists are able to be like, yeah, I know what that is, and they can identify it, and then suddenly everyone's like, whoa, and they can add it to their projects they're doing to look at some of those native plant species and animal species that maybe are rare, and not as many people see them, but if they're seeing that many people are seeing them places, then it helps them kind of understand where they are, and where they grow and survive and things like that. So yeah, there's definitely action steps we can take as individuals and as families and groups. Even if you live in the valley or the mountains, there's stuff that you can do to help spread awareness and to help preserve and protect this special region within our county.
Well, we're going to go ahead and end it right here. We thank you for watching, and just stay tuned because we're going to be doing more of these throughout both this week and the start of next. So, yeah, if you guys have any creatures that you'd like to learn more about, please leave your creature in the comments, or if you've got a plant that you'd like to learn more about that you know that's in the area or out of the area too, feel free to reach out. Leave a comment, like, subscribe, and just stay tuned and continue to learn and grow and learn about all of the different things in our area and just in your area, wherever you are. You may not even be in the U.S. It's beautiful. Just learn about where you're at and how you can help better nature and nature that you may be around.
Yeah, find ways to give back, because there are a lot of ways that we take, but there are ways that we can maybe leave some of nature as it is and even help to improve it and give back to it. Yeah.
Well, we want to say thank you again, and we'll see you in the next art stream.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.